It's similar to what Stan said. This is not a private sector good, public sector bad presentation from Verizon's standpoint either. I've lived in both worlds, as you've heard. It's always nice, of course, for Verizon not to be the villain. And it's getting easier these years. A few years back, we had James Earl Jones as our spokesman. And of course, he was the voice of Darth Vader. So it was very easy to paint us into that corner. And I'm very happy to be here today for a particular reason. That is, from my wife's perspective, today is the pinnacle of my professional career. And the reason for that is that she's Northeastern 1988 grad. So as far as she's concerned, everything I've done has led up to today. And after this, it's all downhill. Yeah. Reach the top. Next slide. Here's our chest thumping slide. We just describe who we are, what we do. We are a wireless provider, we're a broadband provider, we're a traditional telephone provider. Verizon was born from a lot of different companies building up into it. We're a combination of two of the baby bells, Bell Atlantic and 9X, which broke apart from AT&T at the time of divestiture, but also combined with GTE, which was a local phone provider, but not part of the AT&T Bell system. And through a series of mergers, the Verizon company has built up. We're also merged with MCI in 2005, and that also added to our assets. Can you go to the next slide, please? Just a couple things here I just want to point out to give you a flavor of what Verizon is. Verizon Wireless is a jointly owned venture between Verizon Communications and Vodafone. Vodafone is a UK-based, mainly wireless provider that owns 45% of Verizon Wireless. Verizon Communications owns 55% of it. Verizon Telecom and Verizon Business. Verizon Telecom, generally speaking, is the local phone business. It's what used to be Bell Atlantic, 9X, and GTE. Verizon Business is what used to be MCI. So just to give you a couple data points on that are interesting about our company, you can see that our 2009 revenue from Verizon Wireless was considerably greater than our revenue from what we get as a wired company. But as I mentioned, we only own 55% of that wireless business. Another interesting data point here is that we have local telephone operations in 12 states and the District of Columbia as of July 1, 2010. Now, if I was doing this slide just 6 months ago, that would be 26 states. We recently sold off our local phone operations in 14 states to Frontier Communications. And if I was doing this 5 years ago, it would actually be 30 states. But prior to the Frontier transaction, we had sold off our local phone operations in Hawaii in one transaction, and then a few years later in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont to Fairpoint Communications. So what this shows you is, as a company today, we're smaller than we used to be as a traditional telephone company. We're very big as a broadband provider in the areas that we do serve. We have a large and growing wireless business, and we also have a global IP network in 159 countries. That was the MCI, primarily the internet backbone business, which is a huge global network. Please go. Switch. In terms of what we're doing in Massachusetts, we're now offering our fiber optic to the home, fiber to the home, FiOS branded service in 106 communities in the state. We also provide high-speed internet, which is digital subscriber line service throughout the state, including in Western Mass. There are areas that we don't serve in Western Mass, a few communities, but we are very heavily invested in Western Mass as well as in Eastern Mass. With Verizon Wireless, we're launching just this coming month in December. We're launching the next generation of wireless technology. Which is 4G, also called LTE, long-term evolution. This service was trialed in Boston and Seattle, and Boston is one of the greater Boston area is one of the initial markets for the rollout starting this month. We're projecting that LTE will be available nationally to 2/3 of the U.S. population in 2012 and to almost all by the end of 2013. Now, that's a national number. I'm not saying that that's representing what the rollout will be in any particular area, but that's our national goal.
A quick question, which I'm sure
Sure.
is in the mind of everybody here. Do you have to get a new device to use the new 4G LTE?
4G is, yes, in order to use the new 4G, it will require different devices because it operates on a different technology. It's a pure IP-based technology. It will be backwards compatible with 3G, but 3G is not forward compatible with 4G.
Gotcha.
Is that connected to the iPhone at all?
I don't know. That's information that
You gotta ask Steve Jobs.
when someone asked our CFO that in an internal Verizon meeting, and he said, "If I tell you, I'd have to kill you." And, so we, someone at my pay grade, I don't know when that's coming. We do sell the iPad now.
Yeah, I saw that. That's great. When you say to sell the iPad, it means a service, Verizon service can be bought for the iPad.
Used with the iPad.
Right. Oh, cool.
Just as, in a sense of what we do invest in Massachusetts, we're investing more than $500 million per year in the Commonwealth for video, internet, and phone services. Next, please. This is going to sound familiar because I'm going to echo a lot of what Stan has already said. Verizon believes that ultra-fast broadband will help America use the internet to solve pressing economic and social challenges, and we're a big part of that, of meeting that challenge. Next, please. In terms of broadband policy, we also believe that the goal should be ubiquitous broadband deployment for all, whether you're in a rural area, suburban area, or an urban area. We think that public policy should encourage investment in rapid deployment of broadband services. And we also think that policies can focus on both stimulating supply and demand. One of Stan's charts earlier showed that government can play a role in addition to making greater supply available to customers, but also increasing the demand for services, which should increase subscription rates. Policy should minimize regulations imposed upon the competitive broadband marketplace and use targeted strategies to help ensure that broadband services are available in unserved and underserved areas. Next. Okay. So you're probably wondering, if Verizon is so positive about the economic and societal value of broadband investment, why don't we provide broadband service throughout our Massachusetts service territory? Why are there areas that we don't have either DSL or Fios? And the reason for that is that there's a contrast between a public benefit and a private benefit. We're no longer a competitive, a monopoly provider of services. We're not a utility anymore. And I'll go into that more in a moment, notwithstanding the Globe editorial today, which used the utility word to describe broadband. But we're in a position where we have to have an opportunity to earn a return on our investment. So even where we recognize that there are greater public goods and societal benefits to ubiquitous deployment, that doesn't necessarily mean that it translates into a return on an individual investment in a particular area. And that's why I really don't think this is contradictory for us to say that we recognize the value without being able to necessarily be the one that makes the investment to make it happen. In the past, when telephone companies were regulated as utilities, as monopolies, the government could credibly ensure, and promise an opportunity to earn a return on all investment. The way the utility model works is the utility company invests to serve every customer, and the government guarantees an opportunity to earn a profit, a reasonable profit tied to the cost of money on that investment. So if you're an electric company and you have to build out to serve a particular area, the regulator can promise you a return on that investment, that you'll get your money back. And that's the way it used to work in the telephone industry. When the telephone network, the public telephone network was built out to serve all customers, it was built out on a system of internal subsidies. These internal subsidies were such that long distance service was overpriced, business customer service was overpriced, and urban customer service was overpriced. Essentially, there was monopoly rent earned on service to those customers, and that rent was used to pay for investments that on their own merits would not have been sufficient to cover the costs. So the way that the system was built on this internal subsidies, that ended when competition was introduced into the telephone industry. And most people think that competition came into the telephone industry in 1996 with the passage of the Telecommunications Act of '96 by Congress, which formally opened up all markets to competition across the country. But actually, the federal government was catching up to what had already been done in Massachusetts many years before that. Soon after the divestiture of AT&T in 1984, the Dukakis administration in Massachusetts took a broad look at policy towards the communications industry and decided that it would that its policy goals would be best met by allowing for competition in all markets in the state. This was in a series of orders that started in 1985. The Dukakis administration recognized that competition was the way to go. And so to a large extent, the federal government in '96 was catching up to where Massachusetts had already been 10 years earlier. And importantly, the administration, when they started this policy, also put forth the principle that as competition developed, as markets came to be more robust, the need for regulation would shrink. Regulation was not a good in and of itself. It was a good as a replacement for the discipline of the marketplace. And I bring that up because it highlights the fact that regulatory policy isn't always broken down along clear partisan lines. It's not a Republican-Democratic thing. This was a policy initiative that started with the Dukakis administration, was carried through the Republican administrations and continues today with the Patrick administration, that recognizing the benefits of investment driven by market forces. Similarly, the notion that Massachusetts relies on communications infrastructure is not new. I'd like to read you a quote from a former governor. In comparison with most other states or the nation as a whole, the significance of telecommunications to Massachusetts is enormous. Our economy is based on information-intensive industries such as financial services, medical care, technology, and education. As the telecommunications industry undergoes a fundamental and welcome transformation from monopoly to competitive markets, the challenge of communications policymaking is to encourage the deployment of advanced infrastructure for the benefit of all citizens as control of pricing shifts from government to the competitive marketplace. That was William Weld, Governor Weld, in 1994, but I think it's a quote that would sound very familiar and be very comfortable in Governor Patrick's speeches, or Governor Cellucci's, or Governor Dukakis's, or Governor Swift's. It's a common theme, a recognition of the importance of the infrastructure. In most respects, the policies that were started in 1985 to introduce competition in Massachusetts have been a wild success. We were one of the first states to have local exchange competition, one of the first states to have residential competition in the country. And today, we're now at a point where Verizon, the incumbent provider in almost the entire state serves about half of the number of lines that we did at our peak in the late 1990s and right around the year 2000. Even in Western Mass, we have lines in only half of the households in Western Massachusetts. So when we talk about an area of the state that is less dense than other parts, even there, we're in only around half of the households. There are parts of the state, communities in this state, where we're not even the largest telephone provider. Significant number of communities in the state where we're not the largest telephone provider.
So to be clear there, you're not suggesting the other half don't have telephones. You're saying they're coming from other providers. It's a duopoly or, other providers that are in the area.
Yeah, that's what I think is happening. The universal service numbers, the household penetration numbers haven't changed much for Massachusetts. It's still around 97, 98% of households have telephone service. And
So since Verizon's not there, somebody's doing it.
someone's there. They're getting service from somebody. It doesn't always show up in the data that the FCC collects because the FCC is limited to regulated providers, but a certain number of people have service from wireless only, a certain number of people have service from
Cable.
VoIP over IP providers. Cable, Sharon Gillette has done a great job now of making the FCC's data more robust to capture cable providers. So that at least now is showing up in the FCC data. And then a particular data point that doesn't make me happy and doesn't make my colleague Mr. Conroy happy is Verizon as a traditional telephone company hasn't made a profit in Massachusetts for a very long time. Nomar was the shortstop for the Red Sox the last time we had a profit in Massachusetts. So when I talked earlier about the utility model, where the government could guarantee an opportunity to earn a profit in return for the company making its service available to everybody, that option is no longer available because of the success of introducing competition.
I may be jumping ahead. I'm just curious. You mentioned the utility model is not for you guys anymore, but do you still build out the infrastructure as a utility, as a telephone company, because that's exempted from certain state and local regulations? If you are as a competitor, competitive and new entrant, you are subject to those. I'm
New
not.
entrants are subject to build-out requirements?
Yeah, so some build out. Let me backtrack. When you build out as a phone company, so you can just say, well, this is for the telephone services. You say you are considered as a utilities. So you can just say, well, this is for build out for phone company. All the other two procedures may not be applied. So you can just build out as just like that, faster than anyone else. That's what I'm curious.
Okay. No, it's a very good question. Did everybody hear the question?
If you put it up.
Sure. The question is, do we still build out to all customers as a utility company, as a phone provider?
Infrastructure-wise.
Infrastructure-wise, if you're talking about telephone service, voice telephone service, we're built out to serve all customers in all of the area that's part of our service territory. And that's I think there's 4 towns in Massachusetts where we're not the incumbent telephone company. In all but those 4 towns, we're built out already to serve everybody. Our competitors who come into Massachusetts, there are no build-out requirements for them as a phone company. They build where they want and serve who they want. They're not required to serve all customers, and they don't have any imposition of service territory requirements as we traditionally did as a telephone company. Whether we build out anymore, as I mentioned, we're actually shrinking, not growing. So building out to serve new territories really hasn't been the issue for us as a telephone provider. As a broadband provider, we are not required to build out to serve everybody. That's why I say it's not a utility model for broadband service.
Even though people are calling it that.
Even though people are calling that, we don't have the obligation either legally or we don't take on the obligation financially as a company, for the simple reason that we're no longer in a position of being able to fund investments that we don't consider to be economic by earning a return somewhere else. That's why I say that model has gone. We can't go out and we can't make an investment that we're not gonna make a profit on, hoping to earn that money back somewhere else. Because as I just mentioned, we don't even make a profit on our current business, let alone investments that we haven't already made.
So people understand, coming from characterizing it right, if you were to set up a store, you have to pay for the road to get to the store in order to do business.
Mhm.
And so the build out that you're talking about, if Verizon goes into a community, they have to build the infrastructure for the community to be able to use the service. Is that?
Yeah, we have to build, for example, when we want to expand DSL service in a community, we have to, there's some investment we have to make in electronics
Mm-hmm.
at our central office. Other investment we have to make, I won't get into technical terms, partly because I don't know all of it. But
Yeah.
we have to make, we have to go out to what we call remote terminals.
Yeah.
We have to upgrade some of the plant, the copper plant, to be able to offer DSL service, and we have done that. We did it just a couple of years ago. We expanded to a number of communities in Western Mass. We went in and made those investments, but it's not. It is an additional incremental investment that we have to make in order to expand service.
Which you're required to do for DSL, but not required for.
Oh, we're required to do it for traditional voice telephone
Voice telephone,
service,
yeah.
right? We're not required to do it for broadband, either DSL or Fios.
Gotcha.
What is the current status of broadband service in Western Massachusetts? I mean, we've been talking about this for 20 years or something. What is, how much of Western Mass has broadband access at this point?
Might be better, you probably have the numbers.
Well,
I don't know exactly how you measure it, but by some measure.
It depends, the whole question of who has what is a more difficult question than it may seem at first glance. And part of what the FCC is doing right now is collecting broadband data as part of a map that will be released in February, I believe. And you know, one could argue that, I mean, this is a classic sort of federal funding mechanism, because if this is the private sector, you measure the problem and then you allocate your money in ways that allow you to address that problem. Whereas with federal stimulus, you know, people are competing for federal stimulus funds. They've got a 3-year build-out time horizon, and only when that's all done will the map be completed. It was the way that Congress sort of allocated the money. But the reason in Western Mass, you know, the numbers have shifted for us, and it doesn't necessarily reflect, you know, but for Verizon's investment in, I think it was late summer of '08, the MDI, you know, we've already invested close to $5 million on fiber along I-91. That's not yet been connected to Springfield, and it's not been connected to end users. So I can't point to a tangible investment the MDI has made that's resulted in greater connectivity other than like fire towers, wireless. Yet at the end of this 3-year build out, there will be close to 1 million folks who were part of this service area. So what I would, if you look at this area, this is supposed to represent on this sort of unserved and underserved. When you get out of Greater Springfield,
So the red is underserved.
yeah. So if to be clear, these are unserved or underserved, and we have to be clear that this is based on federal definitions, because if we use this in Western Mass, and people sort of say, well, wait a minute, you know, how can you say this is unserved or underserved? We're using federal definitions here, and the census blocks in rural areas are typically pretty big. So what you will see released by the FCC that we're contributing to, and other states are contributing to, that will be released in February, is much more granular, almost at the street address level. And you know, we've worked closely with Verizon and others because, you know, they've got a proprietary business interest where, you know, there's certain information they want to not necessarily make public. You know, part of the challenge for us is there are some states where, as a result of merger approvals, for example, maybe in California, you know, Verizon might be more willing to disclose information there than they would be here. So part of what the FCC is doing is trying to figure out, you know, ways in which they can sort of get this information for everyone. And one of the things that we're trying to offer in return is by giving this data available to, you know, Verizon, Comcast, anyone who wants it, they can sort of identify customers that they want to go after. So the other piece of this, if you're not that familiar with the topography of Western Mass, you've sort of got ridge lines here and here, and so part of the real challenge is just the topography of this. Even if this were just not just a rural area, but it's very similar to Vermont. And people who don't have broadband also don't get their ridge lines destroyed by these big towers. And so one of the things we're trying to do is more effectively use state assets like fire towers to put antennas on them so that you're not building new tower construction. But I remember when Verizon made their DSL announcement, and it was not met with fanfare in Western Mass because a lot of people sort of said, you know, what are you yet again, if you don't have broadband, the only thing that makes you more annoyed by that is having your neighbor get it and you still don't have it. And so part of the challenge that we're going to have with our Western Mass build out is trying to make sure that we are reserving enough public money to mop up areas that may not be economically feasible to go. And I think the FCC data, these are national numbers, they've said it's about $24 billion to address, to create ubiquitous broadband across the US. They would argue that the annual cost of not having this are close to $55 billion. But if you were to look at that $23.5 billion number, about half of it is to reach the most costly people, which I think in many instances is close to $56,000 per home. So, you know, we refer to that as sort of like the last mile, the guy at the end of the dirt road. And, you know, there may be instances where satellite or some other services, you know, satellite's not real broadband. It's got real latency issues. You can't use it with Skype and other things, video conferencing. But, you know, there may be instances where even the MBI may look at certain places and sort of say, we can't, even with our resources, reach this person, you know, with a fiber to the home type connection, and therefore we're going to use some combination of fiber and wireless.
Is there a plan though in place to address all of this?
Yes. The application that we submitted as a state, the $7.2 billion that was part of the Recovery Act, these were not block grants to states, these were competitive things. So the application we submitted was about this thick, and it has everything from not only the engineering build out, but also the sustainability model, because, you know, what is very important to both the feds and to the state is they don't want to build what I call a digital bridge to nowhere, where you build this out and it's not sustainable. So part of what we're trying to do is make sure that we're building something and it's going to be effectively handed over to a network operator, competitive procurement. It's in place right now. And the challenge is to try to make sure that we are making sure that this network operator is able to make sufficient money to be able to do this, but that they're not getting a windfall with this public investment. And that's a challenge in and of itself. But all of this is, like, if you were to go to massbroadband.org, all the network schematics, diagrams, everything are there, including a lot of the sort of what I consider to be the metrics around
timetable.
It is 3 years. It has to be, the minimum network has to be completed within 3 years of the receipt of the award. And what we are working on is trying to make sure that the last mile access is being built out concurrently with that, in order that when the middle mile network is done, last mile connections are completed as well. They're a little north of 1,000 community anchor institutions. These are things like hospitals, community colleges, town halls, fire stations. Those are going to be directly connected to the Mass Broadband 123 network. But if I'm a business and I'm passed by this Mass Broadband 123, I'm going to be using a last mile connector to get to that. And we're building this out where, you know, the hand holes are, you know, again, I'm not the technical expert, but they're like every quarter mile. It's being built out in a way to make it very cost efficient for someone, whether they be big or small, to come in and do that last mile service.
Paul has about 5 more minutes for this presentation, and we'll wrap up the discussion.
Sure, just quickly, Massachusetts is not the only state that's concerned about unserved areas. I've been involved in a number of different states that have open proceedings or tried in different ways to address their coverage gaps prior to the passage of the ARRA and the stimulus money being available for this. And I'll just give you a couple examples of how different states have approached the issue. In one state where there was coverage gaps, the folks essentially assumed that it was a capitalist conspiracy by a Manhattan-based company not to serve rural America, and that was explaining why we weren't doing that. Anybody here from Vermont? No? All right. Another state just assumed that we were too stupid to recognize profitable opportunities, and that they should use the levers of regulation to try to force us to overcome our stupidity and make investments. Anyone here from Maine? No? All right. The
I'm
third
nervous what he's
state,
gonna say about Massachusetts.
I know, yeah, go down the list there.
the third state decided to provide funding themselves to fill gaps in coverage that may not be economical for private entities alone. So I think that describes MBI. That's I think a responsible way to look at the issue. You know, as I said, we've had other states that have tried to use the fact that we're otherwise regulated as a telephone company to use that as a lever to try to get us to make investments that weren't in our business plan, weren't economic for us to make. And I don't think that's an appropriate way for government to act. But for a government to come in and say, hey, we think this investment is good and we're gonna put up our own money, we're gonna put up public funds to offer this service, recognizing that it may not be economical, and to take the time to go through some kind of business scenario to evaluate whether or not it would be economical for private entities, and then put up their own money. I think it's actually a responsible way to look at things. So if you're looking for me to come in and say what they're doing is bad, what we do is good, I'm not going to say that, because believe me, I see a lot worse out there in terms of how states can try to use the power of government to try to force companies to make investments they would like companies to make that may not be to be economic. But do I think then, does Verizon think that MBI is a good idea? I don't know whether MBI is a good idea or not, the way they're structuring. That's not, you know, I do regulatory policy, not business plans. But I would like to highlight some of the risks that a program like this faces. And in many ways, they're going to be feeling the same kind of pain that a regular company does, and that is you're putting, they're making major investments in a large fixed cost network in an industry that's subject to rapid changes in technology and customer demand. We get ulcers and gray hair from that. It's not an easy industry to make that kind of investment in. We invested $23 billion in our FiOS program, and there's an awful lot of folks on Wall Street who think that was the dumbest thing we could have done. And it pains me. They write reports every couple of months saying how much of a bad idea it was for us to do that.
They still are saying that.
Some analysts, you know, there's some analysts who think it's a good idea. There's some analysts who think it was a bad idea. So hopefully we'll get more analysts think it was a good idea than there are analysts who think it was a bad idea, and our stock can take off. But putting wires in the ground or on poles can be a very risky enterprise. Just to give you one example of that, what can look like a really good idea at one point in time can very quickly start to look foolish. About 10 years ago, Verizon and a lot of other companies saw a business in wiring people's houses with Ethernet connections. As customers were starting to get broadband subscription, more and more houses, it looked like a no-brainer. You were going to have a business that you were going to wire an entire house so that you could have a computer in every room and everybody can be connected to broadband. And Verizon put a lot of money into this. A lot of other people put a lot of money into that. Within 2 years, that business was dead in the water because of Wi-Fi routers. Didn't take long for that entire business plan which looked brilliant at the start, to look really stupid, because wireless technology, as we've seen across the entire industry, is a real game changer. It changes a lot of things. And speaking of game changers, we have 4G coming. I mentioned that earlier. 4G in our testing worked up to 10 to 12 megabytes already in just our early round of testing. That's better than DSL service, and it's all IP. It's got a lower latency than wireline, comparable to wireline. So what will 4G do to wired investments, whether you're talking about, it's not FiOS speed yet, but it is DSL quality. So that's just an example of the type of investment that could make a lot of fixed cost networks risky going forward. But so I'll end there and see if we have any more questions or any
So we
responses.
can